Part 4. Let us continue. Abraham Lincoln's associates and contemporaries are all known to history. The immediate companions of Jesus appear to be, on the other hand, as mythical as he is himself. Who was Matthew? Who was Mark? Who were John, Peter, Judas, and Mary? There is absolutely no evidence that they ever existed. They are not mentioned except in the New Testament books, which, as we shall see, are supposed copies of supposed originals. If Peter ever went to Rome with a new doctrine, how is it that no historian has taken note of him? If Paul visited Athens and preached from Mars Hill, how is it that there is no mention of him or of his strange gospel in the Athenian Chronicles? For all we know, both Peter and Paul may have really existed, but it is only a guess, as we have no means of ascertaining. The uncertainty about the apostles of Jesus is quite in keeping with the uncertainty about Jesus himself. The report that Jesus had 12 apostles seems so mythical. The number 12, like the number 7 or 3 or 40, plays an important role in all sun myths and points to the 12 signs of the zodiac. Jacob had 12 sons. There were 12 tribes of Israel, 12 months in a year, 12 gates or pillars of heaven, etc. In many of the religions of the world, the number 12 is sacred. There have been few God saviors who did not have 12 apostles or messengers. That the 12 apostles are fanciful may be inferred from the obscurity in which the greater number of them have remained. Peter, Paul, John, James, Judas occupy the stage almost exclusively. If Paul was an apostle, we have 14 instead of 12, leaving out Judas and counting Matthias, who was elected in his place. We had 13 apostles. The number 40 also in many primitive myths. The Jews were in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus fasted for 40 days. From the resurrection to the ascension were 40 days. Moses was on the mountain with God for 40 days. An account in which such scrupulous attention is shown to supposed sacred numbers is apt to be more artificial than real. The biographers of Lincoln or of Socrates do not seem to be interested in numbers. They write history, not stories. Again, many of the contemporaries of Lincoln bear written witness to his existence. The historians of the time, the statesmen, the publicists, the chroniclers, all seem to be acquainted with him or to have heard of him. It is impossible to explain why the contemporaries of Jesus, the authors and historians of his time, do not take notice of him. If Abraham Lincoln was important enough to have attracted the attention of his contemporaries, how much more Jesus? How much more Jesus? How much more Jesus? Okay. Is it reconcilable to suppose that is it reasonable to suppose that these pagan and Jewish writers knew of Jesus, had heard of his incomparably great works and sayings, but omitted to give him a page or a line? Could they have been in a conspiracy against him? How else is this unanimous silence to be accounted for? Is it not more likely that the wonder-working Jesus was unknown to them? And he was unknown to them because no such Jesus existed in their day. The following admissions by Christian writers themselves show the helplessness of the early preachers in the presence of inquirers who asked for proofs. The church historian Mosheim writes that the Christian fathers deemed it a pious act to employ deception and fraud. Again, he says, the greatest and most pious teachers were nearly all of them infected with this leprosy. Will not some believer tell us why forgery and fraud were necessary to prove the historicity of Jesus? Another historian, Millman, writes that pious fraud was admitted and avowed by the early missionaries of Jesus. It was an age of literary frauds, writes Bishop Ellicott, speaking of the times immediately following the alleged crucifixion of Jesus. Dr. Giles declares that there can be no doubt that great numbers of books were written with no other purpose than to deceive. And it is the opinion of Dr. Robertson Smith that there was an enormous floating mass of spurious literature created to suit party views. Books which are now rejected as apocryphal were at one time received as inspired, and books which are now believed to be infallible were at one time regarded as of no authority in the Christian world. It certainly is puzzling that there should be a whole literature of fraud and forgery in the name of an historical person. But if Jesus was a myth, we can easily explain the legends and traditions springing up in his name. The early followers of Jesus, then, realizing the force of his objection, did actually resort to interpolation and forgery in order to prove that Jesus was an historical character. One of the oldest critics of the Christian religion was a pagan.